It's great to see this wonderfully full auditorium. We're so delighted that you were able to come out tonight. And I'm Nancy Norwood. I'm the Curator of European Art here at the Memorial Art Gallery. And I want to welcome you to the Nancy S. and Peter O. Brown Guest Lectureship in the Art and Architecture of Ancient Civilizations. No, it's just frozen. Oh, there we go. It was waiting for the drama. So I particularly we all want at MAG to thank Nan and Pete Brown, who are longtime friends of the gallery. 10 years ago, they dedicated this lecture series, and the inaugural Brown Lecture was held with guest speaker Paul Denis from the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, who delivered the lecture Pompeii in the Shadow of the Volcano. Pete has been on the board of MAG, of the Board of Managers, since 1974, so he joined when he was about 10. And he's also served as the longtime chair of MAG's Art Committee. Nan has served as a docent. She's a remarkable jeweler as well, and she's been an active member of the MAG Council, which is the gallery's fundraising body. So we're so grateful for their support and their care in making MAG a vibrant and very exciting place for people in our community. So I'd like to thank you to the Browns. And I'm particularly delighted to introduce tonight's program, which is the 9th lecture in the series. We did take a year off during COVID to welcome Lucian Simmons, who's the head of Provenance research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Mr. Simmons qualified as a lawyer in England in 1984 and specialized in litigation arising from legal malpractice and white-collar crime. This is a really interesting trip to where he is today. He was vice chairman of Sotheby's North America and a senior specialist in Sotheby's Impressionist and Modern Art Department. In 1997, he founded Sotheby's Provenance Research and Restitution Department, at which he then played a key role introducing Sotheby's compliance and due diligence programs relating to cultural prosperity, cultural property, also prosperity. So, I mean, I can't tell you as a curator how important these issues are and how welcome that sort of accountability and transparency is to people in the museum world, but also in the world of collectors. So I'm very, very impressed that what he does with this. He joined the Metropolitan Museum in 2024 to lead the museum's cultural property initiatives and provenance research team. He oversees research efforts on objects in the Met's collection and potential acquisitions that are considered cultural property. So please join me in welcoming Lucian Simmons, who will speak to us on transparency of the Metropolitan Museum, documenting the provenance of a great collection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And thank you also to Peter and Nancy Brown and to Sarah and Chio and the entire team who've been incredibly welcoming here in Rochester. I, as you heard, come from London. I've been in New York for 21 years, and I've been at the Met for a year and a half. And I'm incredibly happy to be at the Met because the museum is committed to transparency and is committed to telling the stories of the objects in its collection. The trustees decided 2 years ago to start a new initiative to really be world leaders in provenance. And I'm incredibly lucky to work with a team of 10 specialist researchers who are embedded in curatorial departments across the museum's collecting categories. Now, I know the official threshold for this speech tonight is talking about objects created before 500 CE in the Common Era, but I will cheat a little bit just to tell my story. But I really wanted to start talking about provenance in general and the Met's approach to provenance and my approach to provenance. You heard when I started at Sotheby's some 28 years ago, provenance was almost a dirty word. It was, if anything, a legal problem which people referred to the counsel's office in the auction house. And people really thought it was just about documenting the chain of owners to the person selling at auction to see if they actually had legal title to sell. But really, for me, provenance is much, much wider than that. And provenance is not just about a chain of recent owners, but it's about who made an object, where it came from, why it was made, and for the Met, the journey it took from its point of origin to New York City, and why it's in New York today, and why it should be in New York today. So it's a much wider issue. And when I first joined the Met, this was the scene in the Great Hall. This is an incredible, not quite an antiquity, but it's 700 AD. It's an incredible stela from Guatemala that was lent to the Met for an exhibition on the Mayan culture by the government of Guatemala. And the thing that excited me about this was not just that it was an incredibly beautiful work of art and was a compelling example of Mayan culture, but also every day when I walked past it, there'd be a group of Guatemalan New Yorkers being photographed in front of it, because they were actually adopting this as part of their culture as New Yorkers who came from the same place as this stela. And for me, that's emblematic of what provenance can be, and my approach to provenance, trying to give things back their story, respect their origins, and respect the route that they've taken to the Met. One other example from my early days at the Met is this incredible suit of armor. If you visit the Met, you go in the main entrance, turn right into the Arms and Armor galleries. And in a case on the right, there's this beautiful suit of armor. And when I first joined, I heard one of the security guards saying to a kid, "Now this is really exciting. You can see where the man who wore the suit of armor was shot." And I thought, that's a great story. I frankly don't believe it, but it's a great story. So I went and spoke to my colleagues, the curators in Arms and Armor, and what they told me was a perfect example for me of provenance. This is actually a relic of the arms race in early 17th century Italy, either from Brescia or from Milan. The armor was worn by cavalrymen, so wearing it on horseback, and it weighs 86 kilos, which must be, 130 pounds, incredibly heavy. And it's an object created to try and protect its wearer from the increase in power of firearms. So as firearms got more and more powerful, so armor is made basically bulletproof armor. And this is so heavy because it has a double chest and a double back to protect the wearer. And armorers then, as they are now, were good marketers. So what they do is to say to their client when they came in, look, this will save you in battle, and I can prove it by shooting the armor. So this is actually a proof mark and a proof that this armor would save the wearer when into battle. And for me, that's perfect. So it's not only where it started, it's also its provenience, why it was made. And the great thing for me is, for didactics, telling children, telling visitors to the museum why they should look at this object, for me, that's the answer. This is not just a beautiful object. It's also evidence and a relic of the past of arms and armor. So I guess I should talk about what I do with my colleagues in our provenance team. The Met has over 1.5 million objects in its care. We are responsible for researching that collection. It's kind of impossible as a job for 10 people. So what we do is to prioritize and say, okay, what we will do is to look at everything that comes into and goes out of the museum. So all acquisitions, all deaccessions, gifts, bequests, and incoming and outgoing loans. And I'll come to that in a minute. But in terms of the existing collection, what we do is to say, okay, within the sphere of 1.5 million objects, we need to focus on the things which are really priorities. And the first priority is antiquities, because they are more in the public eye. There's more legal risk attached to them. Antiquities, I should say, vary in the Met size according to date by different collecting category. Within the field of antiquities, we're particularly focused on antiquities which have entered the Met's collection since 1970, which is the year of the UNESCO Convention, which first laid out international standards for the transactions in ancient works of art. So what I'm doing with my colleagues is looking at antiquities acquired since 1970, and also looking at antiquities acquired since 1970, which were transacted by people who were in the public eye for maybe having been involved in smuggling or in illicit digs. But one of the things which is really important in looking at antiquities is to understand that the mores, the understanding of what is appropriate in the market have changed radically since the museum was first founded. This is the first object acquired by the Metropolitan Museum. This is a beautiful sarcophagus which was discovered in Tarsus in southern Turkey in 1863. It's remarkable because it's in tremendously good condition. It has erodes or putti all the way around it, and along the top it has the putti in acts of war. But the remarkable thing is it was never finished, so it was almost certainly left unsold in the stone yard of the carver back in 200 AD. So this in 1863 was discovered and sold to the American vice consul in southern Turkey, a gentleman called Abdo Debas. And he struck up a friendship with a New Yorker and said, look, I'm really interested in donating this to an American institution. Do you know anybody who might be interested in acquiring it? And the gentleman he spoke to was Augustus Johnson, who was one of the early supporters of the Metropolitan Museum. Metropolitan Museum, I should say, started as an educational establishment, and its first collections were of plaster casts to teach from and not actual historic objects. Long story short, the Metropolitan Museum decided that this was an object it really wanted to acquire. This is some of the correspondence from the Met's archive concerning the transport of this enormously heavy sarcophagus from Turkey to New York. And the Met managed to persuade the US Navy to divert a frigate to pick up the sarcophagus from the Turkish coast and transport it to Philadelphia. And then it came by train. Well, actually, in Turkey, it was carried by 16 buffaloes. And when it got to New York, it was carried by train. And it's still in our galleries today. So that was our first object. But the thing to note is that these days, that would never happen. The Met wouldn't accept a gift from a collector in Turkey without working through the Turkish government, without export documents, and without really understanding where this came from. So that really is a relic of past collecting practices. But this happened in the 1860s, so we're very proud to have this in our collection today. And actually, one other thing I should say, going back to the image, I discovered this week for the first time that these enormous sarcophagi were actually designed for more than one person. They were actually family coffins. So you'll put in the parents and the kids as well. And I saw a sarcophagus in the Met this week that actually has a floor on it. So you could actually have a double-decker coffin within the sarcophagus. So actually this originally, had it been sold, could have been for more than one person. This is another great object in the collection, again, which represents a very different time and a very different collecting practice. This is a wonderful carving from the Palace of Nimrud in ancient West Asia. And I notice upstairs here you have a small object from a beautiful object from the same palace. This is, as I said, an incredible relief. On the left, it shows the God King with his diadem. He's holding a leather bucket, and he's holding a sponge, throwing sacred water at an idol. And on his right is probably a eunuch. You can tell he hasn't got a beard, who is an acolyte and a mortal. This has a wonderful history. This was one of a number of objects which were removed from Nimrud, removed from the walls of the palace during its excavation by a gentleman called Austin Henry Lanyard, who was a British explorer, writer, a man of letters. And this again was in the 1840s, a little earlier than the Tarsus sarcophagus. And it found its way to the Met through a circuitous route. Henry Lanyard's, or Austin Lanyard's mother-in-law was Lady Charlotte Schreiber, who's the lady on the left of the slide, who was a remarkable lady. She was the daughter of an earl. Her first husband was an ironworks manager. He was a founder. He passed away very young, and she took up the mantle of running his business for many years. So as a young aristocratic widow, she ran the business, ran with the unions, and ran the business tremendously successfully. But then she decided to remarry, and she remarried a doctor called Mr. Guest. Her daughter married Austin Henry Lanyard and presented her with a series of these amazing friezes from Nimrod Palace, which she embedded in the walls of her house. At the same time, she made probably the world's largest ever collection of ceramics, including Dr. Wall Worcester and enamels, and she donated 16,000 objects to the Victoria and Albert, another 8,000 to the British Museum, so a tremendous supporter of museums. When she passed away, the frieze was inherited by her children, and it was eventually purchased by by Dickon Kalikian, who was a dealer in New York, and then went to David Rockefeller, who donated the frieze to the Met in 1930. And again, this is an example of an antiquity which will be in our reopening West Asian galleries. They're reopening in a year and a half from now. But we will tell this whole story. We'll tell the story of how they left Nimrod, how they were cut out of the walls of the palace, how they went to England, were in a manor house in Dorset, and then went to the Rockefellers into the museum, because that story is not as important as the objects, but it's a vital part of the objects and how they're seen by the public. And what we're also going to do in the galleries, which is also, for me, part of Provenance, is tell the history of collecting of Assyrian and ancient West Asian works of art. And these are two objects which will be in the galleries as you enter from the staircase. And these are porcelain. They were made in England in the 1870s and 1880s. And they are models of the great Lamsu, the great ceremonial Assyrian bulls in the British Museum in London. And these were commissioned from Copeland in the 1880s by a docent and a guard working in the British Museum who decided they could make a living on the side by selling these to the public, again, as educational tools. They were sold, I think they were £10 each, which in the 1880s was a great deal of money. So as part of our display of the original Assyrian reliefs, we will also include these, telling part of the story of Provenance and of how people appreciated these objects over time and how they got to the museum. Staying with ancient West Asia and staying with the objects which we will have in the galleries when they reopen, again, this is another example of how Moors have changed. The little object on the left is from Tel Brak, which is in northern Syria. And this is an ancient site that was discovered by Leonard Woolley and was then excavated by Max Mallowan in the 1920s and 30s. And as was very common at the time, the digs were financed in Syria by the British School of Archaeology. But part of the deal in those days was that the European financier of the archaeological dig would get to keep half the finds. So the British Institute of Archaeology got to keep half of these amazing eye idols that were discovered in Tel Brak, and they were sent back to England, and then they were parceled out to museums across Europe and America. So this came to England first and then to America through this system, which is called partage. And in the Met's collection today, we have many, many thousands of objects which entered its collection through archaeological digs financed overseas in exchange for a share of the proceeds. I should say this does not happen again. We are being very open about the way in which these objects came into the museum's collection, but these days the Met does finance archaeological digs. We're financing digs in West Asia. I think we're financing it in Kazakhstan at the moment. We normally finance them in Egypt, not currently, but the only thing we bring back is expertise and data. We don't bring back objects. So that's a thing of the past. But all of these objects are objects which will stay in the museum's collection because they're required under a prior system and are no longer regarded as being in any way problematic. And again, going through antiquities and the way they entered the collection, the last category, which I think is interesting and outdated, is a system of firman or contracts which are entered into between mostly Eastern Mediterranean countries and commercial art dealers, where the art dealers would be given a contract which would allow them to excavate a site, export their finds, and give a proportion of what they found to the government and sell the rest. One of the great people who followed this system was Dikram Kalikin, who I mentioned earlier, who was a great collector from the late 19th century up until the 1950s, specializing in Islamic art and particularly in ancient art like this Parthian sculpture, which is in the Met today. And again, this is a category of objects which are not problematic today in the sense of there's no legal issue, although there's not a system that exists anymore, particularly after the UNESCO Convention in 1970. And I should say, when I was looking at Kalikian for the purpose of this lecture, I saw that I think we have over 1,000 objects in the Met's collection which came from Kalikian and from his family, including this series of amazing portraits of the dealer by André Derain, by Milton Avery, by Muller, and by Graham, which really are important for us. So when we re-establish our ancient West Asian galleries, we can not only show the original ancient works of art, but we'll also talk about Kalikian, and we'll talk about his story, and talk about how that provenance caused these objects to enter the museum's collection, and how he is an integral part of the story of each of these objects. So he's part of the string. So as I said, that's part of our job, is looking at the existing collection and trying to understand where individual objects came from, and to understand whether or not they are problematic. But I spent a lot of my time working with the curators in the museum and worrying about where things came from that were being offered for sale or offered as a donation or as a bequest. Particularly for antiquities, I know that I have to persuade my boss, who's the head of collections for the museum, her boss is the director, and also the trustees, that we have a really robust provenance for every object that we acquire today, and that we can prove that it left the country that it came from, either before the 1970 convention, the UNESCO convention, or if it's earlier, before the export law from the country concerned. So I spent a great deal of time working with my colleagues trying to find out where things came from. And this is one object. It's a fabulous object which the Met acquired last year, and it basically passed that test. You can see it's a fragmentary bust of a dignitary from the Ramesside period, so 1000 odd BC. And actually, one of the things I love about this is it has a great provenience as well as great provenance, great history as well as a recent ownership history. This would have been created for a shrine associated with the tomb for the dignitary concerned. It would have been placed in front of the tomb so that the figure of the deceased would be in constant prayer to God or his gods for his soul in the afterlife. So very much like the figures you see in English medieval churches, where people were paid to have praying figures on their tombs who would permanently pray to God for the salvation of their souls. So in ancient Egypt, this piece would have been in the tomb of the dignitary praying for his soul in the afterlife. But the thing I really love is that 200 years after this was carved, it was repurposed. It was taken out of his tomb and it was recarved. And when it was recarved, the figures of gods were inscribed into the chest of the figure. You can see the three figures on the front. The gods were also engraved on his arms and on his back. And also, because fashions had changed, they cinched his waist. They made his waist smaller, took his belly in a little bit, and they devolumized his wig. So he's got a much smaller wig than he used to. So it was repurposed in antiquity, so that it was a more modern-looking object. Then, as you can see, it fell into disuse again, and then it was collected in the late 19th century by a Belgian industrialist called Valéry Mabille, who we know bought it in Egypt between 1880 and 1902. And we know that it was back in Belgium by 1902. It was recorded in his house when he died in 1909. I then found the wedding invitations, the wedding photographs from his children's weddings, showing that it was in his castle after that. And then we found the photograph on the right of the slide, which shows the piece when it was lent to the Egyptological Institute in Brussels in 1934. We then found proof that after 1934, it remained in the chateau, and then in World War II, it was stolen. It was looted. It wasn't looted by the Nazis, though. It was looted by building workers that the family had brought in to do building work. They stole a number of antiquities and 3 cases of wine. And we then found newspaper reports showing the prosecution of these people, showing that they were forced to disgorge the antiquities, the wine had gone. And then we found more photographs in the 1950s. So we found all of that before we were prepared to buy it and accession it to the museum's collection. So that's the amount of detail we go into before we're happy to buy an object. And I'm pleased to say it's going to go on view very shortly. This is another object. This is an object which I worked on with my wonderful colleague Sean Hemingway, who one of you knows in the audience tonight. This was in the same meeting of the Committee of Trustees. And again, this was a thing we really worried about acquiring because it's a Roman antiquity and is just the kind of thing which could have been smuggled out of Italy or could have been illegally excavated. But this was a perfect object because what we found through our research was this photograph, which is in the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, which was taken of this object in the 1860s, proving that it was out of Italy and in Paris by the 1860s. And we also found it was sold in an auction in the Hotel Drouot in Paris in 1891. That's the clip on the top right-hand side of the slide. And then we traced it again, just as with the Egyptian antiquity. We traced it to a collection in Deauville in France, and then sold in an auction in the 1990s, and then tracing it all the way to the dealer who was offering it to us. So again, we went through all of that. We cross-examined the poor dealer who was trying to sell it to us, and it took 6 months of research before we were happy that this was an object that would enter the Met's collection. And this is the last example. Again, this is something which we just put up in the Michael C. Rockefeller wing, which is the wing of the Met that contains our oceanic, ancient American and African art. And again, this caused me a lot of heartburn. This is an object that comes from the Huastec culture in the west of Mexico on the Gulf Coast. It comes from a matriarchal society, wonderful and important piece. And they're very rare outside of Mexico. So I was very anxious to make sure that we had proof that this had left Mexico legitimately and that this was something which we could accession to the museum. I spoke a great deal to my colleague, Joanne Pillsbury, who runs our Ancient Americas collection, and she's able to tell me that these objects were mostly found in the late 19th and early 20th century by German railway engineers who dug the tracks and dug the hardware to put the railway line up the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and in that process discovered many of these amazing figures buried. We know that this piece was in Germany in the 1950s with a great collector of Mexican antiquities. And the really exciting thing about this for me is then as a matriarchal figure, this was acquired by Mary McFadden, the New York fashion designer. And she acquired it when she was married to the director of the first National Museum of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was then, who was responsible for popularizing Shona sculpture, the soapstone sculptures you see a lot from Zimbabwe. And he encouraged her to buy this in the 1960s for the 12 months they were married. And so this object we found was taken from Hamburg all the way down to what is now Zimbabwe to Salisbury. And then when she divorced the museum director, then shipped back to New York, to her New York apartment. And this is Mary McFadden, the designer, shown with this amazing mother figure in her apartment. So we, having established all of that, again, a great deal of detailed work that took 6 months, we were pleased to accept it from her executors in her estate. And after restoration, it's now in our galleries as a great totemic work of sort of girl power, for want of a better word. So that's one part of our job. It's looking at antiquities and looking at how they got into our collection. But that's only one part of our focus. Another focus, particularly in looking at the 1.5 million objects in the collection, is looking at where objects were during World War II. Two reasons for that. Firstly, for me, World War II is extremely important because it was the greatest dislocation by force of artworks from private families, from enemies of the Nazi regime, and from state museums we've ever seen in probably in world history. And secondly, it's important for a legal reason. That is that here in New York State, we're obligated to put signage on every object in any museum collection that's on view that was dislocated in World War II, whether or not it was later given back. So we have a legal obligation to put a notice on every single piece. So I'm very, very focused on looking at the provenance of objects displaced in World War II. I'm showing you this slide because this is one of the historic directors of the Met, a gentleman called James Rorimer, who in World War II was enlisted into a branch of the Allied forces, the Americans, the British, and the French, called the Monuments officers, Monuments men, typically, who were seconded from regular service into trying to track down works of art displaced by the Nazis from private collectors, from enemies, to gather them into one place, into collecting points, as they were called, and then to send them back from the countries from which they came so they could then be returned to their original owners. This photograph was taken in Neuschwanstein in Bavaria in May 1945, and it shows James Rorimer with a box of jewels that had been looted from the Baron de Rothschild in Paris. And the tureen in front was looted from the chairman of Lazare Frères, David Vaille in Paris. And basically, he was one of the people who really focused on provenance first at the Met. And if you want to see his story somewhat revised, there's a movie called The Monuments Men that came out in 2014 with Matt Damon playing a character based on James Rorimer, Kate Blanchett playing a character based on Rose Vallon, who was the French museum curator who was seconded to the Nazi regime working in the Jeu de Paume in Paris, and who during the evenings wrote down notes of what had been stolen from whom and what passed in front of her as it was being looted by the Nazis. The records which really made restitution so much easier after World War II. I should say provenance has always been a focus at the Met. When I first joined, again, I was speaking to my colleagues, and they showed me this, which is this is the first ever catalogue produced by the Metropolitan Museum. It was produced in May 1887, and it's the guide to the pictures in the Met. And even in 1887, it had provenance for some of the pictures in the collection, which impressed me no end. It's a little sketchy, but it's a good start. And then by the 1950s, for a European paintings collection at least, provenance was regularly published. So really, I'm standing on giant shoulders, as you might say, in following these people. But that was a digression. So really, talking about World War II, one of the things which I really am very focused on is going through the collections of the Met, looking for names in the provenance that we have, names of people who were victims of Nazism, people who are despoiled, people who are victimized in World War II, or in fact, in most conflicts in the 20th century, but particularly in World War II. And this was my cover slide. This is an object which belonged to one of those people. This is a fabulous fragmentary relief from Amenhotep I from the New Kingdom from 1500 BC. And this belonged to one of my sort of favorite collectors. The collector was a gentleman called Alphonse Kahn. Alphonse Kahn was born in Vienna to parents who'd made their money in Kimberley in South Africa, a Jewish family. His mother very sadly perished in the Great Magic Lantern Fire in Paris in the 1890s. And he moved to London and became a star trader. It is said that he was insider trading. He certainly made a very, very large fortune in a very short time in London, and moved back to Paris, and then became a voracious art collector. This is a photograph of his desk. Actually, this is not Alphonse Kahn. This is his companion, who was a British Air Force officer called Peter Pitt Millward. But he surrounded himself with the most extraordinary collection of medieval and ancient works of art. Then in 1924, he decided to sell everything up, and he moved all of his old masters, all of his ancient art to New York, where there was a huge sale at the predecessor of Sotheby's in 1927. And this wonderful object was sold at the American Art Association, predecessor of Sotheby's, at that time, and was bought by the Met. But in terms of Alphonse Kahn, this is just one of the objects that the Met has from his collection. And in World War II, he fled from Paris, and 1,400 paintings were stolen from his home in Saint-Germain. So that's 1,400 paintings, plus his furniture, works of art and sculptures. So whenever I see his name in a provenance, I'm incredibly focused to try and make sure that if he owned it, then it was not looted in World War II, and if it was looted, that it was later given back. And if you look at our website, which we're currently redesigning, we have a whole section devoted to artworks that were looted in World War II, so that you can see objects and where they came from. And part of my mission is to try and celebrate the memory of the original collectors. Going back to my time at Sotheby's, one of the things that I used to do when we were asked to sell artworks that had been looted in World War II and were later returned, was to say to the families who were then selling them, what can you tell me about the original collector, so that we can return the history of the collector to the piece, and it becomes a permanent memorial to the original people concerned. And certainly that's so with Alphonse Kahn, who was the most amazing, amazing collector. He was also, I should say, one of the models for Charles Swann in the Remembrance of Things Past by Proust. So that's a good story where I discovered that this piece had belonged to Alphonse Kahn and had not been looted in World War II and was not problematic. But one of the things that exercises me, and one of the things I spend a great deal of time on, is looking at artworks that were less fortunate in their history and that may have been displaced. And on this slide on the left, you have an example of an object which turned out to be a problem. The object itself is in the top of the slide, and it's an incredible protome. So it's a handle, one of three handles from the lip of a ceremonial cauldron that was outside a shrine in ancient Olympia. It's big. It's this size. It's a beautiful archaic Greek bronze. And back in 2018, a scholar spoke to one of my colleagues and said, this. You say in your online catalog that this comes from Olympia in Greece. Have you checked that? Because we're not sure how it left Greece. So my colleagues wrote to the Greek government and said, we have this object, and the provenance we have online is that it comes from Olympia. We're worried about this. Can we collaborate? Can we work with you to try and understand how this piece got from Olympia to Manhattan? What we knew was that the piece had been acquired by the Met from a donor called Mr. Baker back in the 1950s. He had acquired it from a dealer called Joseph Brummer, whose archives are actually in the Met in our Cloisters location. And he had acquired it from a dealer in Athens, but we didn't know how it got from Olympia to Athens. And essentially, we spent from 2018 until earlier this year working with the Greeks, collaborating with the Greeks to try and understand what had happened to this piece. And at the end of that research, what we discovered was that it had been found in an archaeological dig in 1914 in Olympia. It had entered the collection of the Olympia Museum, which was the National Museum of Greece, had disappeared from the museum in the 1920s and had reappeared in Athens where it had been sold. And as it was clearly Greek government property, we decided, the trustees, I should say, decided that the correct thing to do was to repatriate it. And this is a photograph here showing the director of the Met, Max Hollein, with the Greek culture minister, Lina Mondoni, during the ceremony in February when this piece was given back. And I should say this was part of a collaboration with Greece, which goes deeper than just this object. This object will actually be returned to the Met for an exhibition which we're having in our Greek and Roman department next year as part of that collaboration. And on the right of the slide, two more objects which again turned out to be problematic. They are two Benin bronzes, which are shown lying on the stand in the right-hand side of the photograph. And these we discovered had been stolen from the National Museum in Nigeria in the 1950s. We discovered that because they were actually part of the British Museum collection, and the British Museum had repatriated them to Nigeria in the early 50s, and in the mid-50s, they'd left Nigeria again, and it ended up in a private collection in New York and then in the Met. So again, we discovered that these were clearly stolen, so we immediately entered into negotiations with the Greek government, and they were returned 2 years ago, along with the head, which came from a private collection in New York, which had a similar history. And those, for me, are good results. That's a result of solid research, which led to a collaborative research project with the country concerned and the repatriation of those objects. This is another example. This is super recent. This is a matter which was resolved 2 months ago. This is a case which you'll see in the Greek and Roman galleries at the Met. You go into the Great Hall, you turn left, and this is just by the entrance to the current Man Ray exhibition. And what this case shows is the result of many decades of research by a collaboration of scholars working on Greek ceramics or ancient Greek ceramics in the Louvre, in Italy, and in the Met in New York. And these are, I don't actually know how many fragments it is. I think it's about 20 or 30 different fragments, which all came from one giant mixing bowl created in Italy, in southern Italy, in antiquity. And what we discovered, working with the district attorney in Manhattan and with the Italians, was that a certain number of these objects had come from different dealers based in the States and in Europe who've been engaged in smuggling. So basically, those pieces were problematic, but other pieces in the matrix, you can see in the case, were not problematic because they'd actually come out before and were not illegally excavated. So what we decided to do, working with the district attorney's office and with the Italians, was to repatriate the entire case, and then Italy has lent it back to us on a long-term loan. So that's a great solution where this case was tainted by a provenance issue, but it's now back on loan at the Met, so it can be enjoyed by the public, and also the various pieces can be enjoyed separately. And when I was speaking to my colleagues and saying, how can this happen? How can one vase or one vase be found, some of it in the 19th century and some of it in the 1980s? How does that happen? It's one vase. And what they told me was that back in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, people would excavate an archaeological site and would take out the big pieces of a vase and sell them on the market. And then in the 1980s and 90s, people would go back to the site and they'd sieve the spoil piles. They'd sieve the soil that was left over, and they'd take out the small pieces. So one vase could land up, as this did, with 4 or 5 different provenances. So it's my pure ignorance that I didn't know that was how this kind of provenance could work. As I said, collaboration is really the key for me, and it's the most important thing in working in provenance. And this is one of my favorite examples. Again, this is in our Greek and Roman galleries. It's right off the Great Hall, you see this monumental figure from 2 to 3000 BC, a Cycladic figure, a cult figure from the Cyclades. This used to belong to the wonderful New York collector Leonard Stern, who was a fantastic philanthropist, or still is a fantastic philanthropist, supporter of the Metropolitan Museum, and a great collector of antiquities. He approached the Met and said that he would like to work with the Met with a view to his collection landing up in the museum's collections. But we were concerned because some of the collection that he'd acquired on the market, and he was completely in good faith, had difficult provenance in that it could not be proved where these pieces had been before 1970, or they come from dealers who have since been accused of misdeeds in working with smugglers or with illegal excavations. So what we did was to work with Mr. Stern and say, look, the best thing to do is to try and work with the Greek government to find a solution which will enable these pieces to remain on public display, and will also acknowledge the fact that, frankly, we can't prove where they came from. So a deal was done, which was closed in 2022, where Mr. Stern restituted or repatriated his entire collection of more than 120 important Cycladic antiquities to the Hellenic Republic, to the country of Greece. And part of that deal is that they are now on loan to the Met from Greece for the next 25 years. And thereafter, they will be on a rotating loan with Greece, where Greece will send some of their collection to the Met, and the Met will send some of these pieces to Greece. And then after 50 years, the entire collection will go back to the Cycladic Museum in Greece. That's a great solution. And I think that the wonderful thing, and this came out in speaking with your director, Sarah, tonight, one of the great things is these objects were previously out of public sight, and now they're available for study. So any one of you can go to the Met and see them and enjoy them and appreciate this culture from 2000 years BC in our galleries. But more important than that, this led to the signing of a memorandum of understanding between the Met and Greece, where not only will there be a rotation of these Cycladic figures, but there's also a scholar who's come from Greece who works the floor below me in the Met, who's working on this collection of Cycladic figures and is producing a catalogue jointly with the Met and the Greek government in April next year. And they're also working with the Met's scientific department, and they're studying the pigmentation and the colouring on these figures as they were originally used. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, this is how they were originally pigmented with mercury compounds with this red colouring. This is brand new research that the Greeks had never done. And so basically this wonderful, generous act by Mr. Stern means that this research will now unlock Greece's own collections as part of this incredible collaboration. So it's really exciting. And in February this year, I was one of the hosts for an event where the Minister of Culture came over from Greece to talk about this joint project, where basically the Greek people are benefiting not only from the return of these pieces, but also the understanding of their own collections. And this is another wonderful example. This was literally 2 weeks ago. This is another repatriation which we at the Met initiated. Again, our ancient West Asian collection. My wonderful Provenance researcher colleague was looking at this ritual object and discovered that it had left Iraq improperly back in the 1950s before it entered the Met's collection, and so we basically shouldn't have it. So we reached out to the Iraq government and said, look, we really think we should return this to you. We don't think it's legally ours. We think it was stolen, and so really this is not something which should be in the Met's collections. But what we also did was to say, look, we think this is a really important object. So what we'd like to do is to launch a joint research project with you, with the Baghdad Museum, to find out more about this object and its creation. So over the last few months, they've been working together in Germany. And what they did was to X-ray this object, and they proved, and you would have seen a report on this maybe in the New York Times 2 weeks ago, they proved that this was the first example of hollow core lost wax casting ever recorded that we can find. So basically, this is the same technique that was used by Edgar Degas, the same technique used by Michael McCarthy in his. There's a direct line, and I know I'm not supposed to say this, my colleagues get cross with me, but there's a direct line from this to Degas' Little Dancer, which is incredibly exciting. So again, this collaboration, so the Provenance research has led to this tremendous discovery, and we're really hopeful that we can have a further collaboration researching the other pieces that in the Met and in Baghdad, which have this common provenance. And by the way, if you're wondering what the object is, it used to contain cone-shaped ceramic containers, and they would have incense and oils in, which you would flick onto a fire as part of ritual practice. That's likely what it is. So it would greet you as you went into the temple complex, and really a hugely important ritual object. This is the last restitution I'm going to mention. I'm only mentioning it because it really shows where this project can go. A couple of years ago, we discovered that we had 2 objects from ancient Yemen, which had a problematic provenance, and we arranged to return them. But because Yemen is unstable, what the deal that we reached working with the State Department was that these objects would be repatriated to the Yemeni government in exile and would be lent back to the Met until such time as Yemen is safe enough to take care of its own property, working with the Yemeni government, so we're not being high-handed, but working with them. And on that time, we had a great Yemeni ceremony, and we had Yemeni dancers loose in the Met, and it was a tremendous evening. But the coda to that is that this year, a collector in New Zealand contacted the Yemeni government and said that they had a collection of antiquities which had been improperly taken out of Yemen in the 1970s, and they wanted to return them. So what Yemen said was that what they'd like to do is to take these pieces from New Zealand and lend them to the Met until Yemen is stable again. So one of my colleagues flew to Auckland in New Zealand and collected another batch of important Yemeni antiquities, which are also going to be on display in our galleries until Yemen is stable again. So for me, again, that is a wonderful example of where provenance research can go, where it actually leads to collaboration and to basically a benefit not only for the country that these objects came from, but also for the people of New York State. And I was going to leave you with this image. This is probably the most memorable day of my very short, so far, tenure at the Met. This is the oceanic part of the new Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Metropolitan Museum that opened in May this year. When my colleague Maya was going to reinstall these objects, she decided that the correct thing to do was to find out their origin so that she could respect them as part of the new space. The ceiling you can see consists of 270 painted panels, which were commissioned by the then Met curator from the Hill peoples in the north of New Guinea in 1973. And these are panels which would typically be in the roof of the men's great room or the men's lodging in the village. And like many cultures in Australasia and in Oceania, they're decorative, but they're decorative only as a side product. In fact, what they are is a record of dreams, a record of dream roots, and a record of ancestral traditions. So it's more like a map, more like a dream map. From a European context, I can't explain it. But what my colleague Maya said was we really need to respect the provenance of these pieces. Although they're not antiquities, what we need to do is to work with the creators to display it in a way that's respectful to New Guinea. So what we did was to go down to New Guinea, and we found the descendants of the artists who created these panels back in the 1970s. And we said, can you please help us to reinstall them? And what they said is, they said, you've done an aesthetic install, but you've blocked the flows. You've actually blocked the way this should work. This is a map, and what you've put Detroit next to Los Angeles. It doesn't work. They're not next to each other, and so they helped us to reassemble it in a way that is now correct and represents their ancestral world. So when we reopened the galleries, we invited them to the opening, and the opening was at sunrise. It was at 5:30 a.m. And we had a ceremony in the galleries. And this is a shot showing, actually mostly New Zealanders in the front here, but also some of the New Guinea peoples who are the relatives of the creators. And what they did was to say, this is now our sacred space in your museum, in New York City, in New York State. So this is now, as provenance goes, perfect, because this is now not only perfect legal title, but also it's an acknowledgement of where these pieces came from, so that when you enter that space, you're actually acknowledging their past. And just the final word on this, I think when I was at school, I had a school museum, or rather, there was a museum in my school, which was all about ethnography. It was all about taking a Western contemporary view and looking at these objects almost as if they're animals in a zoo. And then kind of the next stage, which was something really when I was at Sotheby's, people would say, gosh, these objects are so great. If you put this object from New Guinea in front of a Mark Rothko, then it looks so chic. And it's almost as good as Western art, which is actually more racist and more problematic. So now we've moved on to another, hopefully a better phase, where we're saying what we really want to do is to look at the provenance, look at where these things came from, how they got here, and try and acknowledge their past. And I think this applies just as much to objects from non-European locations as to old masters, as to antiquities. It's all about trying to tell a story and all about trying to acknowledge the past. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic. We're running a little bit late, but I know that Lucian had some time for a few questions. So if you'd raise your hand, someone will come with a microphone for you to ask. Thanks.
I'm interested in the ways in which terminology is part of this whole discussion. And I'm wondering, for the process by which the Met made the decision to talk about West Asia rather than the Middle East.
That wasn't part of my decision, but I think there is the general feeling is as a scholastic move away from calling it ancient Near East to calling it ancient West Asia. And my colleagues in that team changed the name, I think, 2 months ago to fall in line with current academic thinking. But I wasn't part of that decision, so I can't actually explain why, I'm afraid.
Hi. The question I have is, aside from items that need to be repatriated, what determines the deaccessions and where do they go after they're deaccessioned?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear it. So you're asking where things go after they're deaccessioned?
Mm-hmm. And what determines deaccession aside from items that need to be repatriated?
Okay, so when objects if objects are deaccessioned as part of a restitution or repatriation process, then they will be deaccessioned at the end of a negotiation with the country or the individual concerned. So the trustees will be very careful to make sure that they are dealing with the right bodies. So if it's the heir to a Holocaust victim, they'll need to make sure that they have all the heirship papers together. If it's an object taken from Italy, then the contract will be with the Italian government. So we're extremely conservative and make sure we have all the papers together. I'm not sure that'll answer your question, but I hope so.
Not really. I was asking about items that don't need to be repatriated, items if there's an issue with it, the maintenance of it, there's water damage or something like that. What happens with that? How is it taken care of? Where does it go afterwards if you don't want it in your collection?
Well, so if an object is repatriated because it's stolen, which will be the case with, let's say, the griffin's head I showed to you, then it goes back to the Greek government because they're the true owners, and in a way we don't have a say in what they do with it because they're the true owners. So it'll go back. And the same really applies whenever there's a legal transfer. It's no longer ours, and it's not our business to inquire where it goes if it's stolen, which was the case with many of these objects that I showed to you. Although we are very cautious, and as I explained with the Yemeni case, we work with the State Department to make sure these objects are safe, working with the government in exile until such time as they can be returned to the country of Yemen itself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. I happen to be Pembina Chippewa, Little Shell, originally from Montana. I appreciate your inclusion of the New Guinea people and how that was handled in the Metropolitan. But I am sure there is a vast collection, in addition, of Native American objects, cultural objects from North America and, in fact, the Americas. And some of those might be masks, they might be ceremonial objects. Have any of those been repatriated, and how would you handle that, and what are the parameters of that? Here in Rochester, New York, we have the Science Museum, which has repatriated and actually removed certain objects that is in their Native American collection. So I'm interested in what you have to say about that.
Well, I actually have a very good answer. I have a wonderful colleague called Jennifer Day, who is our NAGPRA researcher, so Native American Grace Repatriation Act researcher. And she has reached out to federally recognized tribes for, I think, all of our collection that comes from those tribes. And we have repatriated a number of objects to tribes across America, and we are in dialogue with multiple tribes as I speak. And objects are, so for instance, in the Medical C Rockefeller Wing, there are no Native American objects on display until our consultation is finished, and we make sure that there is no claim against them under the NAGPRA Act. I suppose it's a very specific answer, but we are very, very focused on that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. In regards to specifically the fragmentary crater, when you decide to publish your provenance narrative, do you acknowledge that there are different pieces that have different paths, or do you publish it kind of all together? How do you approach that?
So we, for that particular example, now it's on loan, it's on our website, and we cite the different provenance for the different loan numbers. So it's somewhat telegraphic, it's quite short, but it is divided out. And I should say one of the things we're doing for transparency is publishing provenances for our Ancient West Asia collection and our and also for our Rockefeller Wing collection, so Oceanic, Ancient Americas, and African collections. All that provenance is on the labels and is also online for all our objects. So our aim is to get the provenance online for all 1.5 million objects. I think as I stand here, we're up to, I think, I'm making this up, it's like 700 or 800,000. And most of the ones that are not online are prints and drawings, and it includes our baseball card collections.
You showed us a catalog that goes back a ways as a useful tool in determining provenance, and I happen to have a catalog that's probably 100, 150 years old from an art house in Eastern Europe, and I'm just trying to figure out what to do with it. Who should I address something to if I were going to try to provide it back to those people?
So the wonderful thing doing this work now, as opposed to doing it when I started 25 years ago, is there are unbelievably good online resources. So the catalog I showed you from the 1890s for the figure of Pan with a basket on his head is digitized by the French government and is on their website. So what I always say is if you have an early or rare catalog, then see if your museum wants to put into their library, or the ideal place is the Frick Art Reference Library, who are digitizing catalogs, and also the Met is digitizing catalogs. So try and get it to an institution who will look after it and see if they can get it online.
Yes, I was just, hi, over here. You had mentioned with the pieces at the Met in World War II, that New York State requires that they be labeled as dislocated objects or disenfranchised objects. Is that not standard practice outside of New York State or in other museums?
It's a very complicated question. So that is a specific requirement of the legislature in our state. Certainly the Met's practice is to publish all provenance online. So it would already be online, but this is a particular notice that things were stolen in World War II. I think we're the only state who has an obligation, although many museums do have full provenance that will include that. And also the American Association of Museum Directors has guidelines that involve the publication of artworks that have an incomplete provenance for World War II. So there are various places these things will be found, but in this state, it was felt that it was important visitors to the museum would actually be confronted with a label on the artwork in real time. So I think we're the only state who has that rule.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.